Welcome to Module 6. This week, we're going to talk about child and youth care as a profession. And in talking about it as a profession, we're going to refer to Carol Stewart's lovely piece you've been reading this week. This sort of compares our profession developmentally to stages in youth, adolescence, adulthood, maturity, but also does a really nice job of pointing out how different generations bring different things to our field, how the people who started our field brought a certain generational interest, certain aspects of their generation came into play, certain things that were important. And we talked last week about phenomenology and existentialism. And these are ideas that really were developed in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. And they're still deeply influential in our field, but in another sense, they really constitute the infancy of our field, where we really started. Now, of course, that gets complicated because they're also the roots of our fields. So just like one doesn't want to reject the sort of things that one learned when one was very young, when one is a child. In fact, in our field, child and youth care, we actually really value and put importance upon the experience of young people and the validity of that experience and how important that experience is in sort of informing us about the capacities that we have as adults. And so in the same sort of way, I think the things that were at the root of our field, these ideas of experience, of genuineness, of empathy, of caring, of acting, of hanging out and hanging in, these sorts of things that are at the root of our field, of course, are deeply influential. On the other hand, as we move forward into the 21st century, we bring all sorts of interesting things into play. We have virtual media, we have video games, we have a worldwide global economy, we have new forms of value. The generations that are coming up behind us have all sorts of interesting inflections in terms of what they bring to the table. And this is something that Carol really points out, that we have to, as child and youth care workers, we can't just simply adopt the logic of our times. We have to be more dynamic and more flexible in that. Unlike a lot of adults that as they get older get more and more set in their ways and more sure that the things that had happened in their childhood, the things that had happened in their adolescence, the things that had happened in their early adulthood, that those things are the things that are most important and that the world is somehow losing those things. It's sort of to be involved in what I would call nostalgia and resentment. That is to say, to have a yearning for a world that was, rather than a total immersion in the world as it is. Antonio Negri, who was a political activist in the 70s, 80s, and well, even into today, says something very interesting about this. He was part of a political movement in Italy that pretty much utterly failed. It was an attempt to change Italian society, and he ended up in prison for a very long time. And when he was in prison, he noticed that his colleagues and comrades who were in prison with him had this sort of bitterness. They sort of said, you know, we lost, and the world is a worse place because we lost, and our revolution failed, and as a result of which, the world is becoming a place that is rather terrible and awful. Negri said something very interesting about this. He says, you know, we create the world as it is. The world is our creation. Society is our creation. So to the degree that we failed, that's our accountability and our responsibility. But more importantly, we cannot afford to be resentful about our failure. We cannot afford to be nostalgic for a past that never was, or worse yet, nostalgic for a future that may not be. In other words, a yearning for a world that isn't yet. Instead, he says we have to deal with the world as it is, and we have to be responsible for changing that world. Well, I would argue that that's the same thing about child and youth care, that we can't be yearning for the values of our childhood, for example, the idea that we're going to bring back factories as a major mode of our economy, the idea that we're going to go back to a world in which the working class was able to make a decent living. These sorts of ideas are gone. The idea that we're going to go back to a world in which there was strict parental authority in the home, and that was a very good thing. The idea that children didn't have video games or social media and this sort of mythic utopian world in which children were playing in the woods and running around. To some degree, of course, those things did happen. But in another way, there were some pretty awful things that were happening during that same period in terms of racism and sexism, in terms of vicious bigotry towards gay, lesbian, queer, transgender people, bisexual people. And I think we need to let go of any sort of nostalgia for the past if we're going to be really good child and youth care workers. We need to join in the world as it is, good, bad, and indifferent. And of course, there is all of those elements. There are all of those elements available to us. There are really, really awful things about the world as it's coming forward into the 21st century. There are things that are pretty wonderful in terms of the possibilities and capacities of what we might do with the world. And there are things that are truly dangerous that we have to watch out for. But to the degree that we continue to compare the world as it's becoming to the world as it was, we're kind of going to lose out. It's sort of like instead of seeing a young person in front of you as who they are and coming into them, as we've talked about, an authentic encounter, we hold them only in terms of what we read in their file about their history. And we read them constantly through their history instead of really seeing them for who they are now. And so, in that sense, the development of our profession for child and youth care has a great deal to do with, yes, being respectful, certainly, of the gifts that our elders gave us, as I said in the piece that I contributed this week, but also to come into the world as it is, to acknowledge how important it is to really be in the now. If we're going to assist young people in becoming as fully themselves as possible, and in that becoming maybe change the world just a little bit, then we have to be able to have the courage to face the world without any rose-colored glasses. Now, that's not to say to be fearful or bitter or angry about the conditions in the world, although certainly there's things that might make one any number of those things. It is instead to sort of come to the world and see it for what it is, but most importantly, to see it as a set of capacities, a set of things that we might do, things that we might do with children, things that we might do with young people, things that would allow the new world that young people are creating to assist us in transforming ourselves, to bringing ourselves fully into the historical moment in which we live, to bring ourselves fully forward into the world. Now, the beautiful thing about that is that child and youth care as a field is constantly shifting. The characteristics that we talked about last time with Tom Garfat, he always says, look, I'm changing those all the time. I'm constantly modifying them, constantly tweaking them, because the work that we do is changing, because the world that we're in is changing. And I think Carol Stewart has it right that we're going through a process of development. The one place that I might disagree with her is that there is any end point, any kind of maturity that we might achieve. I kind of like to think of us as an always adolescent field. That is to say, and we'll talk about this in a later module, as a space that is indeterminate, a space of pure creativity in which we are constantly becoming without ever arriving at maturity. Because in some senses, becoming an adult, as the philosopher Zórzeczfili says, is to die just a little bit, because we lose that forceful creativity of being a child. So I hope that we can remain childlike and adolescent in our pursuit of our field, and at the same time bring the clarity of maturity to be able to see the world as it is. All right, I will see you next week. Look forward to reading your reflections. Take good care.